Next, install the stress relief mastic. Begin wrapping the SRM between the connector and the insulation. As you wrap, keep the SRM stretched to 1/2 of its original width, and be sure that you fill in the gaps on both sides of the connector. When you heat shrink the first tube into place, the SRM will melt, fuse to itself, and eliminate these gaps. Continue wrapping the SRM around the connector until it is slightly larger than the outside diameter of the insulation.
Be sure to overlap the cable insulation by 3/4 of an inch on the paper side and by 1/4 of an inch on the poly side.
If the connector diameter is larger than the insulation diameter, apply only 2 half-lap layers of SRM over the entire connector. Next, you will apply the diagonally cut SRM at the edges of the semicon cutback. To do this, lay the point of the SRM on the insulation and against the edge of the semicon cutback. Then stretch the SRM to 1/2 of its original width and wrap it until it is the same thickness as the semicon. Overlap and taper the SRM onto both the insulation and the semicon by 1/4 of an inch. Repeat this procedure on the other semicon edges and discard the excess SRM. Now you are ready to install the internal tubings. To ease the installation, first apply DCC grease over the SRM. Center the black stress control tube over the completed connector area, equally overlapping the poly cable semicon and the paper cable conductive tube. This will prevent sticking of the SRM as you complete the other 2 phases using the procedure demonstrated on the first conductor. When all 3 black stress control tubes are in place, shrink them together using a medium flame. Begin by adjusting your torch to achieve a 12-inch bushy flame. Then, starting at the center, work the outer 3 to 4 inches of the flame around the tubes using a smooth brushing motion. Once the center is completely shrunk, slowly move the torch toward one end of the tubes while holding it in a 40-degree angle. This preheats the tubes and forces air out of it to assure a smooth, void-free interface. After finishing the first side, return to the center of the tubes and continue heating the other side using the same procedure. Once both sides are completed, post-heat the entire length of the tubes to achieve a smooth surface profile. Be sure to check the installed tubes using a gloved hand for even wall thickness and reheat any wrinkled areas. Center the red insulating tubes and shrink into place using the same procedure as the black stress control tubes. Again, be sure to check the surface of the tubes with a gloved hand. At both ends of the red insulating tubes, apply the red internal sealant over the cable semicon, building it up to the level of the red insulating tube. This sealant will prevent moisture from entering the splice through a damaged cable jacket outside of the splice area. Next, position the black-red dual-layer tubes and shrink into place using the same method as mentioned previously. Be sure to check the tubes for even shrinkage before moving to the next step. After shrinking the dual-layer tubes, position the black reinforcing tubes over the connector area and shrink in place. For the poly side, there are several methods of connecting the ground braid depending on the cable shielding type. For copper tape shielded cables, flare one end of the ground braid and place it onto the metallic tape, butt it up to the red sealant. Attach the braid to the shield by placing 2 wraps of the spring clamp over the braid. Fold the braid back over the spring clamp wraps. Continue to wrap the remaining clamp over the braid and tighten the clamp by twisting it in the direction it is wrapped. Secure with copper foil tape. For drain wire or uni-shield cables, first pigtail the shield wires together. Then, crimp the ground braid to the pigtail using the connector included in the splice kit. For lead sheath cables, solder the ground braid onto the lead sheath and deburr any sharp points. For jacketed concentric neutral cables, pigtail the neutral wires together and crimp them to the ground braid using an appropriate connector. Once the braids are attached to the poly side of the joint, lay the braids across the splice tubes and solder to the lead sheath. Be sure to deburr any sharp points. Now we are ready to apply the shielding mesh. Starting at the poly side, apply a half-lap layer of shielding mesh across the splice and tie off or solder to the lead sheath. Next, abrade and solvent clean the cable jackets or lead sheath on both sides of the splice for 8 inches. Then move the non-conductive sealing breakout boot into place and shrink starting at the fingers and working toward the center of the splice. This will prevent moisture from entering the splice between the single conductor cables. To ensure a good seal to the outer jacket of the splice, apply 1 to 2 wraps of red sealant over the body of the sealing boot. We will now install the outer wraparound sleeve. After taping over all sharp points, remove the backing from the wraparound sleeve and center it over the splice. Slide the metal channel and clips in place and shrink beginning at the center and working towards each end. After the sleeve is completely shrunk, continue to heat the entire length for approximately 30 seconds, concentrating on the metal channel area. This completes your 15 kV trifurcating transition splice. Remember to let the splice cool before moving it or placing the cable in service. By following the written instructions and the information contained in this program, you can be confident that you are installing a durable, watertight splice. Some key points to remember when installing a transition splice are: be sure to follow all safety requirements prior to installing any cable accessory. Follow proper cable preparation techniques and clean all surfaces using an approved solvent. Abrade and clean the lead surface before applying the oil seal. Be sure to fill in the gaps between the connector and insulation cutback when installing the stress relief mastic. Check all heat shrink tubes for even wall thickness, wrinkles, and flat spots using a gloved hand. And finally, abrade and clean the cable jackets to achieve a good moisture seal. If you have any questions regarding the installation of Raychem's 15, 25, or 35 kV trifurcating transition splices, please contact your local Raychem representative or call 1-800-327-6996.